There's someone in your life right now who hasn't raised their voice once. They haven't threatened you. They haven't chased you. And somehow, without doing a single dramatic thing, they are quietly dismantling everything you built to protect yourself. And the scary part is, you don't even see it happening. Most people think the avoidant always wins. They pull away, they go cold, they disappear, and the other person chases. That's how it usually goes. But not this time. Not when the other person is a super empath. Because a super empath doesn't chase, they don't beg, they don't perform, and that is exactly what makes them so dangerous to the avoidant ego. If you've ever wondered why certain people make avoidance completely unravel, stay with me. Because what I'm about to show you is something most people never see coming. And if you are an avoidant, you need to hear this more than anyone. Drop the word mirror in the comments if this is already hitting close to home. Sign number 1. They stop reflecting you back to yourself. Here's something about avoidance that almost nobody talks about openly. Avoidants have a very specific emotional diet. They need people around them who react. They need someone who gets upset when they pull away, someone who texts twice when they don't respond, someone who visibly needs them, even if they say they don't want to be needed. That emotional reaction from the other person is what keeps the avoidant feeling like they're in control. It confirms their internal story. The story that says closeness leads to loss of freedom. The story that says if I stay, I'll be consumed. The reaction from the other person is the fuel that keeps the avoidance defense system running smoothly. Now enter the super empath, and watch what happens when the fuel disappears. A super empath has done the internal work. They've sat with their own pain long enough to understand it. They've felt abandonment, loneliness, rejection. But they've processed it instead of running from it. So when the avoidant does their classic withdrawal move, the super empath doesn't panic. They don't spiral. They don't flood the avoidant's phone with messages at midnight asking what they did wrong. They just get quiet. Peacefully, purposefully quiet. And that silence hits the avoidant like a bucket of ice water, because the avoidant's entire emotional architecture is built around one assumption, that if they pull away, the other person will come closer. That's the pattern they've always known. Pull away, person panics, avoidant feels in control again. But when the super empath doesn't come closer, when they don't react the way the system expects, something breaks in the machinery. The avoidant starts checking their phone. They start replaying conversations. They start wondering if they went too far this time. They start wondering if the empath is okay. And then, without even realizing it, the avoidant starts thinking about the empath more than the empath is thinking about them. The power has quietly shifted, not through games, not through manipulation, simply through the empath knowing their own worth enough to not perform panic on cue. The avoidance ego runs on predictability. When someone stops being predictable, the ego has nothing to grip onto. And a gripless ego is a shaking ego. The empath didn't do anything aggressive. They didn't make a big speech about boundaries. They just stopped feeding the machine, and the machine started eating itself. This is where avoidants start feeling something they almost never feel in relationships, and that feeling is anxiety. Not the comfortable, controlled anxiety of wondering if someone's too close, but the raw, uncontrollable anxiety of wondering if someone is slipping away. Anxiety that they caused. Anxiety that their own defense mechanism created. And there is nothing more destabilizing to an avoidant ego than being on the receiving end of the very thing they've always done to others. But it gets deeper, and sign number 2 is where it really starts to crack the foundation. Sign number 2. They see through the mask without saying a word. Avoidants are exceptionally good at presenting a version of themselves that says, I don't need anyone. They've curated this identity for years, sometimes decades. The image of someone who is self-sufficient, unbothered, independent, fine with being alone. They wear this image like armor, and in most relationships it works. The other person either believes the mask or is too afraid to challenge it. Either way, the mask stays intact and the avoidant stays safe. But a super empath doesn't challenge the mask. They don't rip it off dramatically. They don't call the avoidant out in some confrontational scene. They do something far more unsettling. They simply look at it with full awareness and say nothing. Super empaths have spent years reading emotional undercurrents. They feel what people are not saying. They notice the micro expressions, the tiny hesitations, The moments where someone says, "I'm fine," but their energy says something completely different. They've developed this skill not because they're nosy or invasive, but because their own survival required them to read rooms accurately, to sense shifts before they became storms, to know when something was wrong before it was said out loud. So when an avoidant shows up with their carefully constructed mask, the super empath sees the mask, and they see what's behind it at the same time. They see the loneliness. They see the fear. They see the little child who decided at some point that needing people was too dangerous. They see all of it, clearly, without judgment. And they hold that seeing very quietly inside themselves. The avoidant can feel this. They can't explain it. They can't name it. But somewhere in the interaction, they feel uncomfortably transparent, like their carefully organized bookshelves have been gently rearranged while they were out of the room. Nothing is broken, nothing dramatic happened, but something is different and they don't know what. This feeling is deeply threatening to the avoidant ego, because the ego's entire job is to maintain the illusion, to convince both the outside world and the avoidant themselves that the armor is real, that the independence is natural, that the distance is chosen, not feared. When someone sees through that without being told, without being given any information, without making a scene about it, the illusion starts to feel less solid. The avoidant may start behaving strangely. They might overcompensate, say something about how they really do need their alone time, as if the empath accused them of something. They might suddenly become very chatty and warm in moments where they're usually distant, as if trying to prove to themselves that they're not afraid of closeness. They might pick small fights because conflict is familiar territory, and it gives them a reason to retreat that feels logical rather than emotional. All of this behavior is the ego scrambling, trying to recover the solid ground it felt just moments ago, trying to make the empath react in a way that's familiar, trying to put the interaction back into a pattern the avoidant knows how to navigate. But the super empath keeps being steady, warm but not desperate, present but not clingy, aware but not broadcasting that awareness. And that steadiness is like acid on the avoidance mask, slow, patient, unrelenting. Now, sign number 3 is where most avoidants start to feel something they genuinely don't have a name for. Sign number 3. They love without needing anything back. This one is counterintuitive. Everything in the avoidance history has taught them that love comes with a transaction. Someone gives you affection, and in return, they need something. They need your time, your attention, your emotional availability, your presence, your future. And because that transaction feels like a cage, avoidants learn to stay away from the gift shop entirely. They don't want the affection if it comes with a receipt. But a super empath's love doesn't come with a receipt, not because they're a pushover or they have no needs, but because they've done enough internal work to love from a place of overflow rather than emptiness. They give warmth because warmth is who they are. They give care because they genuinely care, not because they're running a subconscious ledger that they'll present to you at the worst possible moment. And this absolutely bewilders the avoidant, because the avoidant has a very sophisticated internal alarm system that's designed to detect the transaction, to hear the strings attached, to feel the hidden expectation underneath the kindness. They've developed this system because they've been burned before, because love in their history often came with conditions, with pressure, with an emotional weight they weren't able to carry. So now they scan every gesture for the strings. With the super empath, the scan comes up empty, over and over again. The kindness arrives and there's no bill. The warmth is offered and there's no demand following it. The empath expresses care and then they just go about their day without hovering for a response, without checking if the care landed, without needing confirmation that they did enough. The avoidant doesn't know what to do with this. And that uncertainty is destabilizing in a way that pressure and neediness never could be. Because when someone is needy, the avoidant has a strategy. Pull away, create distance. The strategy works. But when someone is genuinely self-contained and genuinely caring at the same time, the strategy has no target. You can't run from someone who isn't chasing you. You can't create distance from someone who isn't crowding you. The avoidant's entire defensive toolkit becomes useless. And then something starts to happen underneath the surface. The avoidant starts to feel safe. Real safety. Not the false safety of being alone where nobody can get close, but the terrifying, unfamiliar safety of being near someone who isn't going to weaponize your vulnerability. And because this feeling is so unfamiliar, it is also absolutely terrifying in a completely different way than closeness usually terrifies them. The ego starts to have a crisis. Because the ego was built on the belief that safety and connection are opposites, that you can have closeness or you can have peace, but not both. And here is this person quietly proving that belief wrong simply by existing in the way they exist, simply by loving in the way they love. That crack in the belief system is not loud, but it is wide. And once a foundational belief starts to crack, the entire structure above it becomes unstable. The avoidant might not be able to tell you why they keep thinking about this person. They might not be able to explain why they feel this strange, uncomfortable pull. They might try to convince themselves it's just novelty, that it'll wear off, that they're just curious. But underneath all that rationalization is a simple, terrifying truth. They have found someone who makes their defenses feel not just unnecessary, but actually kind of exhausting to maintain. And that is the beginning of a very deep unraveling. Sign number 4 is the final one. And this is the one that truly breaks the avoidant ego open. Sign number 4. They walk away without anger. This is the one nobody sees coming. Not the avoidant, not even most people watching from the outside. Because we all expect that if someone stays long enough, gives enough, loves without condition long enough, eventually they snap. Eventually they break down. Eventually they deliver the speech you've been waiting for, the tearful confrontation, the desperate plea, the explosion of everything they've been holding in. The avoidant is waiting for this too. On some level, they're almost counting on it, because an emotional explosion is something they know how to deal with. It confirms their deepest beliefs. It says closeness makes people crazy. It says love turns into chaos. It gives them the perfect reason to finally leave without feeling responsible for the outcome. The explosion is their exit ramp. But the super empath doesn't explode. When a super empath finally reaches their limit, they don't perform it. They don't announce it dramatically. They don't give the avoidant the scene they unconsciously wanted. They just get quiet in a different way than before. A more settled kind of quiet. And then they start to genuinely withdraw. Not to get a reaction, not as a tactic, but because they have actually decided. Because a super empath, after all the patience and all the love and all the steady presence, eventually reaches a place of clarity. And from that place of clarity, they make a clean, undramatic decision to stop. They might say something simple. They might say something kind, even. They might express genuine warmth, even as they step back. And then they go. And they mean it. And they don't look back in the desperate way the avoidant is used to seeing. They don't come back 3 days later having reconsidered. They don't send the 2 a.m. message asking if there's still a chance. They just leave the way a person leaves when they know themselves well enough to know this is the right thing. And that is when the avoidant ego completely shatters. Because everything the avoidant believed is suddenly turned on its head. They believed they were the ones who could leave without looking back. They believed they were the untouchable one. They believed that the empath needed them more than they needed the empath. And now they're standing in the aftermath of a clean, dignified exit that they did not perform. An exit that the person they underestimated performed instead, and performed flawlessly. The avoidant starts to feel the loss. But it's not just the loss of a relationship, it's the loss of their story about themselves. The story that said, I am the one who doesn't need people. The story that said, I am the one who can take or leave anyone. Because if that story were true, this wouldn't hurt. If they really didn't need people, really didn't need this person, then a clean exit would be nothing. A footnote. But it's not nothing. It's consuming. It's everywhere. It's in every quiet moment and every distraction they try to pour themselves into. And because the empath left without anger, without giving the avoidant something to push back against, there's no defense that works. You can't be angry at someone who left with love. You can't dismiss someone who had the self-possession to walk away cleanly. You can't comfort yourself by saying they were too needy or too much when they clearly weren't. They were measured, they were real, they were honest, and they left without making you the villain even though they had every right to. That is when the avoidant ego runs out of stories. that is when the real reckoning begins. Not the reckoning that happens in a fight. Not the reckoning that happens when someone screams all your faults at you. But the quiet, internal, inescapable reckoning that happens when you're alone at midnight and the person you told yourself you didn't need is genuinely, peacefully gone. And you realize that the strategies you've been using your whole life just cost you something you actually wanted. Something real. Something rare. And it's gone not because they couldn't handle you, but because they could handle themselves. That is what a super empath does to an avoidance ego. Not through cruelty, not through games, not through revenge or manipulation or any of the things the avoidant could have prepared for. Through four things that are quietly and completely unstoppable. Stopping the emotional feeding loop, seeing through the mask with warm, knowing eyes, loving without conditions or hidden receipts, and leaving with more grace and dignity than the avoidant ever gave them credit for being capable of. Now here's the thing about all of this that most people miss when they're in the middle of it. Whether you're the empath or the avoidant in this dynamic, you are being shaped by it. You are being asked by life to grow in a direction you probably didn't choose voluntarily. Avoidants who survive this kind of unraveling often become their most honest, most emotionally real selves. Because you can't keep a story going that's been completely dismantled. At some point, you either rebuild honestly or you disappear into a more defended version of yourself that costs you everything warm in life. And super empaths who learn to walk away with grace rather than waiting for the avoidant to finally choose them, they transform too. Because every time a super empath chooses themselves without anger, without cruelty, without making it a performance, they reinforce the most important thing they'll ever know about themselves, which is that their love is real, their peace is earned, and neither of those things are owed to someone who is not yet able to receive them. If you have been the empath in this story, I want you to sit with something for a moment. The patience you showed was not weakness. The love you gave was not a mistake. The way you stayed grounded while someone else ran cycles around you took more strength than most people will ever understand. But walking away is not giving up. Walking away with your warmth still intact is the final act of power in a dynamic that tried to take everything from you. If you have been the avoidant in this story, and you're watching this because something in the title reached through the screen and grabbed you, then you already know something is moving underneath the surface. You don't watch content about things that don't apply to you. Something in you is ready to stop running. Not because running doesn't work, but because you're beginning to feel what it costs. And the price is getting higher every time. The avoidant ego does not die easily. It was built to survive. It was built out of real pain by a real person who needed protection at a time when protection was not provided by the people who were supposed to provide it. That architecture deserves compassion, not contempt. But it also deserves honesty. And the honest truth is that the same walls that kept you safe are now keeping out everything worth having. The super empath didn't destroy your ego to hurt you. They destroyed it simply by being whole while standing next to you. That is not an attack. That is an invitation. And whether you choose to walk through that invitation or build a higher wall around it is the most important choice you will face in the quiet hours when the defenses are tired and the real you is awake. This dynamic between the super empath and the avoidant is not a war. It never was. It is two wounded systems trying to find safety in completely opposite directions. And when one of them has done enough healing to stop running, the other is left alone with their running. And that aloneness is the loudest thing in the world. Pay attention to the people who make your defenses feel unnecessary. They are showing you something about who you could be if you stop spending all your energy on protection. Pay attention to the people who leave with their love still intact. They are showing you the kind of person you could love if you learn to stay. And pay attention to what happens inside you in the days after something real walks quietly out of your life. That feeling is not weakness. That feeling is information. That feeling is the version of you that is tired of the armor asking politely if you'd be willing to put it down for just a little while and see what happens. Something real is possible for you. Not despite the avoidant patterns, not despite the wounds that created the walls, but because underneath all of it there is still a person who felt things deeply enough to need protection in the first place. And a person who feels deeply is a person who has the capacity to love deeply. The capacity was never the problem. The safety was the problem. And safety is something that can be built, slowly, honestly, with the right person and the right level of readiness. The super empath who walks away cleanly is not your enemy. They might be the most honest mirror you ever looked into. And what they reflected back was not your inadequacy, it was your potential, hidden behind years of armor, waiting for the moment you decide the view from inside the walls is no longer worth what you're giving up to maintain them. That moment might be right now. And that would not be a loss. That would be the beginning of something that looks nothing like anything you've allowed yourself to have before. And it would be worth every uncomfortable second of getting there.